Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Pinkbike podcast presented with Intense. And I'm joined by Pinkbike big boss Brian Park as we sort of have a bit of a dive into Intense's history as well as what it's doing and some of the interesting changes it's got in terms of not only the bikes it's bringing out, but also how you could buy your next Intense. So I'm joined by founder and creative director Jeff Stieber, technical director John Hall, and VP of Sales and Marketing Mike Carr as we get into it. Jeff, we were talking a bit about, what we're going to discuss today before just now in the green room, so to speak. And you were saying that, how to put this, that the story and the history of Intense has been covered in great depth over the years, numerous times. But there seems to be a bit of a real appetite in the audience to find out more about this brand that, you're right, has been really well documented. What is it about your brand and your history, do you think, that really strikes a chord with the core mountain biker?
Going years back, and I'm going to date myself here a little bit, turn of the century, when I started Intense, there was no business plan. I was just making cool bikes initially for myself. And then eventually, racers, specifically downhill racers, saw the product and latched onto it. And if you remember in that era, early 90s, downhill racers were racing on hardtails basically, and, with a suspension fork and limited travel. And I never started making hardtails. Or I just right away, from an off-road background a little bit in motocross and that sort of thing, I realized, hey, we're riding off-road, we need suspension. So with one of the very early adopters of suspension or full suspension mountain bikes. So that was one of the things that differentiated Intense in the early years and kind of put us on the map. And it also caught the attention of the downhill racers of that era. So I really, played on my strengths at the time and capitalized on that. And the fact that, and especially in that era, I was, and still am, was more of a designer, artist, craftsman kind of a person. So if I got into something, I always had to put my spin on it, try and make it better, build it myself. And, not being like classically trained as a frame builder or anything like that, I came at it with a totally different approach. So almost out of the gate in the Intense bike, or the frame, looked completely different. Sealed cartridge bearings, CNC machine parts, shaped tubes, and eventually even formed aluminum sections like monocoque, stretch formed, became a signature of the Intense identity. And there was nothing like it at the time. So we really stood out. And a lot of people levitated towards that, I think. It kind of, at the time in the early years reminded me of being in the US and being a Porsche or a Ferrari fan. And, the brands hadn't really made it over here yet. And so, the passion drove people to get these cars. And at times, maybe, it was a little hard to get parts and that sort of thing and service, but they were so passionate about it that the brands just, grew
I remember looking through Mountain Bike Action or Bike Mag or whatever in 97, 98, 99 and into the early 2000s and scheming how could I buy one of these bikes? How many lawns do I have to mow? What do I have to do? I don't think I ever saw an Intense in person, probably until 2007.
Well, that era, that's a truth with a lot of people. And there's even a lot of collectors and, people that are into the retro downhill scene that are passionate and collect and restore old M1 frames, and you name it. I see it. There's some groups on the internet and stuff.
I need those people to stop driving the price of old Marzocchi RAC forks up. They got to stop it. It's not acceptable. $4,000 is not acceptable. You guys got to stop it.
But, back to Henry's question a little bit, just to add one thing, it probably didn't hurt to have someone like Sean Palmer in that era decide that, hey, I want to give a try at downhill mountain biking. And Intense was situated in SoCal in the Inland Empire. At the time, it was the 909 area code, 951 now. But it was kind of home to, like it still is, to a lot of the motocross, supercross, the heroes of the day, and training tracks, and teams were situated out of here. So there was an early on connection with Intense to the power sports, through like cross training. A lot of these guys rode bikes and mountain bikes as cross training and for fun. And it related, Palmer, Mike Metzger, Randy Lawrence, sorry guys, I'm throwing your names out there, but it is, it is a big part of this, that kind of magical time in the history of mountain biking and downhilling and Intense. And it really, Intense was part of that really helped change the face of downhill and downhill racing in that era.
Well, I think, when you think about that era of downhill, something that is almost synonymous, at least for me when thinking about that time, is a lot of brands rebadging Intense frames to race them. Mike, that must be, from a brand's point of view, kind of the dream ticket. It's the same with maybe Maxxis have had it, Schwalbe even with tires over the years. If other people are choosing to have the difficult conversation with their sponsors and say, hey, we ultimately will get a better result, that's one hell of an endorsement, hey?
I mean, what better form of flattery, right, than that? And for Jeff to have produced a bike that performed the way that the bike performed, and to have it be as aesthetically and visually distinct as it was, and to have so many racers want to be on that platform, regardless of what brand sponsored them, like that's a really cool component of the brand history, and to the image and the brand that Jeff has built. And so, as someone who's worked within other brands, like, trying to emulate that is really, really hard. And I don't know that anybody has since then. And so that's a pretty cool part of our DNA.
Jeff, did you make them pay for those frames?
The only requirement of the time was that it had the Intense sticker, logo sticker on the seat stay. And it was a great opportunity. I seized it, seized the moment. Was, influencing the influencers to the max. This is pre-internet, of course. Yeah, I mean, just it's not like it was handed to me, but it kind of was. It was an opportunity, and there equally could have been some other brands at the era that like Foes and Turner that had some really innovative and unique product and still do, but it just the way the stars aligned, or whatever, my motivation and spirit to make it happen, it all came together, and I got to work with some of the greatest athletes in the sport at the time, and I run into these people now and in different roles out there or at a World Cup, and we have that connection still from those early years. They may have, had their bike badged as a Giant or an Iron Horse or a Mongoose or umpteen many others, but there is a rich history, and recently for my Mountain Bike Hall of Fame induction, I had to make a list of all the people that I worked with over the years, and that Intense worked with and rode the M1 frame, for example, and it was a long list. Yeah, it was pretty big. Yeah.
John, when you joined Intense initially as I guess working for the race team very directly, and you had the opportunity to, starting on, I believe you would have started on that carbon bike before going to this, what at the time in 2022 came out as this kind of crazy looking prototype. It had that raw metal look. It was very, very different.
Yep.
What was it like, sort of, being one of the caretakers or the custodians of a brand like Intense, and as a fan of mountain biking, have the opportunity to push it forward?
I mean, it was crazy. It was, you don't realize it at the time. as you know, like when you're part of a race team and a mechanic and working for guys like Aaron Gwynn, like, I mean, head in the weeds, you don't oftentimes look up to kind of realize what you're doing, or what you're even a part of. You know, it can just seem like a regular mundane, everyday run of the mill something, you know. But as time goes on, you start to think about it. And I have the same story as so many other people. Like one of my good friends that got me into riding, Rory Zimmelman, was the first one in our friend group who got an intense downhill bike. I can't remember if it was an M1 or M3. I can't remember.
What era? Like what year?
Early 2000s. So probably like 02, 03, somewhere around in there. And I just remember, like, first thing I did when he asked me if I wanted to ride it at the bike shop was I just like smashed straight over a curb, and it was the classic like red and yellow with the Dorado on it, and I was like, that was amazing. And he scolded me, said, please don't do that again. You know, but when I first came on board, you know, it was such an easy transition because I lived here in Temecula at the time. I knew and rode with all the guys that worked here anyways. And so it was such an easy, just slipped right in, felt right at home, super comfortable right away. Like I had kind of always been here. But it was different in the way that when you're at the top level in the World Cup circuit, and you're obviously providing feedback to all your sponsors. You know, it's every single component on that bike, you're providing feedback or pros, cons, and you're working with the brands at arm's distance to improve it or change it, and stuff like that. But that was about as far as it went. You know, I had pretty in-depth experience with that, but it was so broad with all the brands and sponsors. But when I came on board at Intense, it was like this whole new opportunity where it was kind of like all those years of experience and feedback paid off, and I was able to almost like have an influence and impart my knowledge. Finally, it stopped feeling like a trade secret and keeping it all to myself, and I could just like open my book and give it, and it was received by people who wanted it. You know what I mean? It wasn't just like, yep, I'm an engineer, I know better, don't do that, like whatever. You know, it was one of my first conversations with Jeff was I literally was like the gearbox bike, and I was he just had a conversation with me one day, and he said, hey, I just want you to know, like, if you ever have an idea, I don't care what it is, how crazy it is, wild, whatever, please tell me. Like, we love innovating, whether it comes to life or not, or if it's just an afternoon project in the workshop, like, where we want to try something, like, just give me a call, let me know. And I was on a mountain bike ride, and I stopped at the top of the climb and called Jeff, and I was like, I have an idea that I've been trying to get across the finish line for a long time, gearbox bike. And then, as you mentioned, that bike that you saw was kind of took over priority. So after starting with the M29, gathering feedback data and everything, and then wanting to kind of shift directions on the downhill bike, and then that's when you started seeing all that, and then all that input and effort kind of went into that project.
I just have to add something to that. Just watching John grow within our organization, and when I first, and I knew him vaguely from out on the World Cup circuit, but more so from the association and the success in racing with Aaron and being Aaron's head mechanic. And in a lot of those years, I wasn't so present at the World Cups, but knowing John from Temecula and that area probably more. But when we started working with the Aaron Gwynn era with John at the helm there, I started seeing like his strengths, and one of those that he's like a true craftsman. So that always impresses me. You need people like that. He's quite good at MacGyvering things when it's needed to be done and coming up with solutions. So it was an easy transition for him to move into a full product development R&D role. I mean, we just recently talked to John, I'm going to have you tacking and fabricating frames here, pretty soon. Like, he got the skills, he already, and let's just go there. And it's even broadened out a little more, and to the point of be an integral part of the next, crop of products that we're going to be bringing to market here this year and in the future. There's quite a shift in some directions, and John does have his thumbprint on that, and that's been awesome. Yeah.
When we just something I've always thought was curious was when thinking about design freedom and being able to make what you want and what the racers want. It was quite a big departure to move away from VPP. Brands go in on these suspension systems, but they also get invested not in terms of just the engineering expertise, but also their brand image, their marketing, how they're positioned. Was it hard to walk away from a system which, we talk again about what, it means different things to different people, but to a certain part of the audience, VPP is like MIPS. It's like having a stick on the helmet that says quality. But when we talk about trade secrets, that's not always the case in terms of people that review bikes, people that ride bikes, people that race bikes. What was that like?
Well, I'm going to speak from part of it from the relationship working with as the sole licensee with Santa Cruz of the VPP platform from pretty much day one and the introduction. And what a great period of time and working with those guys, such a solid crew of people and friendships, everything. I've always been impressed with what Rob Roscoff and his crew had done with the brand, and and always probably a little envious and jealous at the same time that they were able to achieve the success they have, and and have such a polished machine and take it to where it is today. That said, working with them initially, I think the whole idea of Intense coming on board as a sole licensee was because we had such a pedigree in full suspension and racing. And if you remember in those early 2000 era, there wasn't, Santa Cruz really hadn't gotten into the racing scene yet so much. And it was probably a part of it as a big innovation or an endorsement to have the Intense name attached to this new technology. And very early on, I think I was rolling up to Santa Cruz with prototypes of evolutions of the initial concepts that were based off of the Outland bikes of that era, probably before they were able to get stuff to prototype stage and that. But worked with them, worked really well. But there was always certain perimeters that we worked in. We had to align our products so that they weren't necessarily competing. Intense had a little different marketing and different philosophy for geometry and aesthetic and all of that sort of stuff. But at the same time, there was a collaboration to move VPP forward, make it better, and a sharing of information. They actually helped us be a better company in a lot of ways.
But was it hard to leave it behind though? Because, we all know that VPP is, Santa Cruz are very much in on it. But what goes into the decision of saying whether it's John and the team's feedback or whether it's a case of this is as far as it can go?
Let me say one more thing on that, because that's an important point. And I kind of, in that previous part, might have missed the core of your question. Yeah. So along the way, we always had our own ideas of how we wanted to tweak the suspension and this and that, and make improvements on it. And sometimes it was accepted and sometimes it wasn't. And they had the last, call if something could move forward. So, and another big driver was at the time, the patent ran out. So it was either we continue to use it and work something out, or we stretch out and initiate some of our ideas. And now we have a lot more latitude to work with. And I always had this kind of thought in my mind that it was all about, to optimize, not compromise the suspension. And so at times I felt like when you're stuck with one suspension system, sometimes it works great on a short travel bike, but it's kind of pushing its abilities when you push it into a different travel or a segment. So, and it doesn't always translate to the optimum that it could. So, in moving forward, you might see that we have a couple different platforms that we work with that are the best for the segment the bike is designed for.
What was the, I think I just, I'm in Vancouver, so I have to stick up for the UBC research folks who were the original Outland, the inventors of the VPP, I guess. But what can you speak to what that meant that you said like the sole licensee part?
Well, Santa Cruz at the time, I think, they had the insight to acquire the patent and the rights to the concept. And it was always interesting to me, even when the Outland bikes were out there and we were racing and, our bikes were competing with them and that sort of thing. But I felt like it needed to be evolved quite a bit. And Santa Cruz had the same philosophy, but the ideas, the core, so say, meat of the patent that was covered, the concept at the time was solid, and the thought in that area, you have to remember that there was a lot of weight put on having this some sort of your own IP around the next or fourth generation suspension design or something that really set your bikes apart. That blanket has been kind of lifted, these days. And we're seeing 4-bar bikes, pretty simple designs with good geometry and suspension tuning competing with multi-link bikes, for example, on kind of the same level.
I think to your point, Henry, it wasn't difficult to depart from VPP once we realized that kind of basically the shackles were off. We hit a point where we said, what if we just removed any limitations? What if we just wipe the slate clean? What does that look like? And once we kind of made like that internal shift, maybe probably driven by the race team, then it was easier to Jeff's point, to focus on platform by platform. And like you said, VPP is a great suspension system, but when you move from travel segment to travel segment, your compromises begin to change or be more apparent. So it's an amazing platform and it works really well on short travel bikes. But as you get into the longer travel bikes, you start running into walls, and maybe you're a bit more limited on what you can do or what you can achieve based off what you're after and the feedback and track speeds and track design and all that kind of stuff. So that's why with the M1 we departed so quick, or not quickly, but so far from the VPP. But if you look through the development of the M1, you can watch us do it. And so we went from the M29 to then the mixed wheel craze was going, and we had to have that. So then if we were going to do a whole new, we tested that concept on the M29 with the 275 specific rear. Then that moved into, well, let's play with the kinematics, shock placement, and that kind of stuff on a prototype on a dedicated 279 bike. That evolved into that the 4-bar version of it that we raced for a season. Learned a ton from that, and then we just went to, like a phrase that Jeff likes to use all the time is be a learn it all, not a know it all. So let's just use this process and learn everything that we possibly can. And then we learned everything from the 4-bar, and then we went to the multi-link or the 6-link version of it. And so it was a very natural progression to move away from VPP on that specific platform, but we're not abandoning it by any means entirely for the brand.
If I could just jump in as well there, because in an age of CNC prototype frames, some of which these people tell you they cost 25 grand to make one, these what do you think?
Hey Henry, how much do you think it costs to have Jeff weld a frame up? Come on, it's going to cost.
I was going to say, what's his day
easy.
rate? Is it 25 grand?
Yeah, probably.
Well, yeah. I was going to say, what are the cost implications doing it in welding?
It was expensive. I'm not going to get into the financials of it, but it was expensive, and it's often easy to forget that when you're on the circuit and you just know that you can ask and receive and ask and receive, and so it was necessary at the time. When the end goal is to win races and to develop a product that's going to give the athletes what they need to do their job, as well as be attractive to customers and basically not have any limitations for the customer, and to provide a product for them that's going to allow them to go to the bike park or to their local race series and enjoy themselves and things like that. So it's ultimately like from a narrow lens, it's for performance, it's for these athletes, it's why we go racing, it's what we do. But in a larger lens, and bigger picture, it's for the end consumer as well, and we want them to be stoked. But if we can dial it in and stoke athletes out, then in theory there should be no question why a consumer shouldn't love this bike and have zero limitations with it.
Should we go to the consumer side here? And like the last 5 years have been a roller coaster for the industry. I'd
Yep.
love to talk a bit about like how has Intense fared through that, and like before we talk about sort of where you're going, because you have a pretty interesting thing that I guess we're announcing or talking about here on this podcast. But I think it's important that I'd like to know how's Intense navigated this last pretty wild stretch.
I'm going to let Mike handle this part of it, but it's what drove what we're announcing now. Going back to what I said, like you kind of have to lift your head out and come up for a breath of air from racing, and remember why you're doing this, and it's for the customer. You're building a product for people to go out and enjoy their weekends and enjoy their group rides with their friends and get to the bottom of the trail and be friggin' stoked on what you just rode and the equipment you're on. And so that's what started driving. And then you start paying more attention to the customers and what they're saying and what they're asking for. And then you start to pick up on everything and you go, hold on a second, like something's not quite right here. And maybe they're not stoked on not necessarily the product, but how their access to the product is, you know what I mean? And they go, dang it. And then that's what starts driving these conversations about this program we're launching today.
Yeah, and I gotta add one thing real quick. There was basically a kind of a moment of recognition there where we were pricing the core riders out of our product, out of the bikes. That was happening, and even before COVID and the kind of the bike industry depression, so to say, or recession that we're in, that was driving me to like try new things and different ways to get product to the market to kind of bring the prices. You could have a premium boutique bike at a reasonable price, and made it accessible to those core riders and Intense fans again.
So one of the things you did to deal with that was to create some of these quite inexpensive or good value opportunities through, say, like the Costco deal. How did that, like, was that a positive for you folks? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I can jump in on some of this, and maybe I'll start by saying what we talked about in the green room before this recording started, which is I, like you guys, I'm a mountain biker first. I'm a consumer of mountain bike goods first and foremost. That happens to get to work in the industry, which is super rad. But having been a consumer, having purchased multiple mountain bikes in my day before I got into the industry, and since I've been in the industry, it's like I have a pretty good sense for how that experience goes. And to go back to the original question around the journey of the brand and what Jeff teed up is, as Jeff made the decision to go from US based assembled aluminum frames to Asian manufactured carbon fiber frames, that was like that first step into like full bike production. So we went from frame focus at that point to bike focus.
And could you give some dates here just to help people understand what time scale we're talking about here?
Yeah, 2009, we were pretty late to get into the carbon game because, again, we were a premier U.S. manufacturer of high-end alloy frames. And just like we saw happen, in that era and even earlier with carbon, with road bikes moving to carbon fiber, the same thing was happening, obviously, with mountain bikes. And that was tough because that was one of our big unique selling propositions for the Intense brand, was that we had a we differentiated ourselves by the frame, like extensively. Like we were a frame only brand, and we sold lots of frames around the world. You know, we had a complete complement from XC all the way to downhill.
Speaking of differentiation there, Mike, could you just help, just to go back to that sort of Costco point, because the word differentiation is really interesting, because a lot of consumers have been told over the past 10 years, carbon is the premium product. It is where the cost goes, etc., etc. And how that works, because in some ways it feels like these are dovetailing a bit, because it's the I believe there'd have been the 951, some of those bikes, the carbon bikes in Costco, and then the race team is racing a hand welded aluminium bike, and then the M1 is released as the ultra. It's almost like, what is it? Was carbon being premium all just a ruse? What is going on with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what I would say is, if we go back to the history of Intense and that moment in time where Jeff took that bold step to say, I'm going to scale from a US based alloy frame company to a much bigger, more capable Asian based carbon fiber bicycle company, because that's the natural progression, right? Like, what brand wouldn't want to take that next step and generate that scale and that reach and really drive your brand across the globe? That's the natural step. But what happens, and what happened for the Intense brand, is you start making compromises and you start recognizing that now you're playing a game against much larger, much more heavily funded brands that make it really hard for a small brand to compete upon. While that's occurring, I think you're also sort of detuning the uniqueness of the Intense brand, right? Because what then happens is you're not focused as much on the frame design and kinematics and the uniqueness and the craftsmanship, but now you're starting to compete with all these other brands on a spec level and less on a frame level and a kinematic standpoint and what's so unique and distinct about the frame, which is the heart of the bike. And so we naturally went that way, and then found ourselves going, wait a minute, this is a really tough model for a brand of our scale. But once you go there, you're kind of there, and it's like, how do we make the best of that? So that was sort of like that first step towards big scale, big production, and that being in Asia through carbon manufacturing. And of course, the perception is carbon fiber is a superior material. It's lightweight, vibration absorption, all those things, and it can be mass produced in a way in Asia that alloy just can't touch. So that was a natural course of action, I would say, for this brand. And through that time, I think that, and this was pre me, but Jeff can speak to it, like there was a struggle to really understand, like, how do we provide the rider with what they want in a way that it fits a budget and it fits a value proposition, but we're trying to do it when we're competing with brands with way more purchasing power and way more scale. And we struggled. The brand struggled. And it was as we started to get closer to COVID, and obviously that was the big global surprise. Like, no one knew that was coming, but some of these cracks in our own system were already being highlighted, and we were already trying to figure out, like, okay, what do we need to do next to make sure that we're focusing on what's most important for the rider, and that is so aligned with us as a brand. And as that was going on, we were approached by Costco. Okay, so imagine you're a small little mountain bike company in Temecula, California, and one of the largest retailers in the world comes knocking on your door. You're probably going to take that meeting, right? Because the opportunity to harness that platform as a segue to scale and to do all these great things that we wanted to do was interesting enough for us to have that conversation. And, Jeff can talk about this probably better than anyone. I think that when Costco presented their premium offering and how their strategy was to step into a much higher level of premium offerings for their ridership, the ask was, would Intense like to be interested in that? And fortunately, I think at the time, Jeff and others were uncomfortable with allowing the Intense brand to go down that road for obvious reasons. And so the decision was made. That probably doesn't make sense for our brand. However, if we were to be able to create a sub brand and differentiate that sub brand as being much more value driven, and to do it in a way that firmly is entrenched in a rider acquisition strategy, because at the end of the day, if we can get more people on mountain bikes, why is that a bad thing, right? If we can get more people riding on the trails and going into their local bike shop and just immersing themselves into this sport, like that's a pretty good thing for the industry. And that strategy really was hinging upon customer acquisition and trying to do it in a way that kept it separate from the Intense brand. The reality is that all of this happened right about the time COVID was coming about. And suddenly there's an incredible amount of supply chain disruption, right? And so the story goes. And what I would say about the Costco approach and the 951 brand was that it was not optimized for that true separation of Intense to 951. And it wasn't optimized enough in understanding who the Costco buyer is and creating even further distinction between the Intense buyer and perhaps the Costco buyer.
Would you do it again? If you had a time machine going back, would you make the same decision, do you think?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, and we ask ourselves that often. And today, as we sit here, we don't have a 2025 plan with Costco today, and I firmly believe that if done well, and if done with enough separation from the true Intense brand and enough separation from the independent bike dealer channel that we so desperately want to support and to be healthy, if that model can truly bring 10, 20, 30,000 new riders into the market who are going to find themselves in local bike shops buying helmets and protection and apparel and service work and all of that stuff, and then those riders aspire to their next bike being an Intense bike, I think that's a strategy worth considering.
Jeff, how did the dealers react to the Costco program?
I think there was a little bit of brand confusion at the same time, a lot of interest, and at the time, and I'm going to speak from my own personal journey, the whole concept, and what kind of sold me on it was more that we had this opportunity to create this a little more accessible brand with 951 and do some things with it that I probably would never do with Intense. Kids bikes, some different commuter products, more cost efficient bikes, things like that, and umpteen many more. But it would allow us then, and the idea was, and this is what we're doing now, is it allow us to sharpen the Intense brand a little more. Because in a pyramid, Intense is just that very little tip of the market share, and that's where it lives, and probably will always stay there. But a brand like 951, and the idea was a little broader, market appeal, that sort of thing. And I'm going to go back a ways, because this journey started along when we were talking about Intense going from a premium alloy U.S. manufactured frame company to doing carbon and complete assembly out of Taiwan. There was this inflection point for me where it was like, we created this great brand. And the brand always created this big shadow, like compared to the actual enterprise or the company itself. So we get journalists or people visiting us at our factory, and they're going, "Oh my God, I thought you guys were much bigger, on a global scope and all, because of the brand just carried so much attention, and I guess through different periods of the life there. At the same time, that really wasn't my strength. I was more this designer, artist, craftsman guy, and maybe the world's most reluctant businessman. I don't know, but there was an opportunity there, to like take this authentic brand and grow. And I'm sure there's been many, entrepreneurs, that have gone through this same journey. And I lived it. It was pretty emotional, that transition going, from one thing that I knew and did really well. Like, I've always been a guy who builds stuff. I still do to this day. Like the prototype frames, I build them by hand, here in the factory. So a little bit of my soul, went along with that whole journey. But not to say that, in a way, I feel like where we're going now is kind of full circle and returning to some of that.
Do you think does it almost feel a bit like, if you could explain where you are going, it seems like a direct response almost, in a way. It feels like the antipode of, if we think of one side of the industry being, getting more people on mountain bikes, definitely a good thing, 100%. Going through a brand like Costco, probably to, a lot of Pinkbike listeners will probably felt a certain way, to be frank. They probably weren't overly stoked to see that happen. But now this seems like serving the ultimate core rider. So if you could explain the changes, I think that'd be really interesting to know if what the link is between the two.
Yeah, I could jump in there to say COVID did amazing things for the mountain bike industry for about a year and a half, right? Like, we all thought this is amazing, and there was incredibly irresponsible decisions made all throughout the industry, all these false indicators as to what bell of the ball that mountain biking now is to the outdoor industry based on COVID. And as we went through that and came out the other side, I think an incredibly bright light has been shown on the brokenness of the industry model. And I think it's important to have a distinction between the industry from a hobby standpoint and the industry as a business. And so mountain biking as a hobby and as a sport and as a recreational activity is alive and well and healthy and prosperous and growing. And there's more trails being built. There's more riders on trails. There's more new riders entering the market. Like, it's a very healthy industry from that standpoint. The model that exists, the business model that props up that industry, has an incredible amount of brokenness. And we've seen and we've felt that since COVID. And some of the challenges in the industry, and this will play into what we're trying to do differently to solve for some of this. But historically, for those that don't have full clarity on the back end and the behind the scenes industry and how it works, it's a very slow and inflexible system. And what do I mean by that? Well, spec decisions for most brands are made anywhere from 12 to 18 months prior to those bikes arriving at the dealership as being sellable, right? So that's a long time horizon that the brand is making bets with the supply chain. The supply chain is financing that typically through terms. And all of that creates this really long time continuum, so that by the time that bike lands at the dealership, that spec may not be the most pertinent and relevant spec any longer. The suspension companies may have launched a new fork, or there may be a new shock that the rider really, really wants. And so it creates this strain, and it creates this moment where, are these bikes really the most relevant at the time? And so that's a challenge, right? I think that the OEs, the bike brands, having to place really large investments and really large bets with the supply chain in Asia has to be financed, and it has to be financed by someone, and someone has to pay for that. Ultimately, that gets paid by the customer. The rider's going to pay that. So as we think about escalation of prices and being priced out of the market, and when does it stop, a lot of that's systematic and it's built into the current system. That's a problem. The OE brands historically take this risk, and then they'll go to the IBD, the independent bicycle dealer, and they'll say, Mr. Dealer, I need you to commit to 12 months worth of inventory because I've committed to all this stuff, and I'm going to give you terms to get you to do something that you probably don't really want to do. It probably doesn't make great financial sense, but that's how it works. And so now the IBD, the dealer, is like, oh boy, we just signed our pre-book. We got to get after it because we've got 12 months of inventory that's going to start coming in. And it doesn't always come in when they want it to, right? Sometimes it comes in at a really bad time. And so ultimately, all of this financing and all of the pushing of the actual payment being due down the road, that gets paid for by the rider.
Well, and specifically, Mike, you mean that's money that's coming from the rider, and it's not going into your pocket either. It's going out of the industry to a bank.
Correct.
Yeah.
Those financing charges that come along the journey in multiple different ways, the rider's paying for it in the price of the bike.
Mhm.
That's happening. And that's a broken part of the model. And as COVID happened, and then post-COVID happened, and then everybody had too much inventory, right? Every OE brand has too much. The supply chain has too much. The demand that was going like this during COVID has flattened. And so it's created this really challenging moment where everybody in the industry is taking exaggerated promotional activities to try to work through the inventory. All of that.
Listeners, that's code for everybody lowered their prices, which is really annoying for us because it's very hard to sell a premium bicycle product when everybody's 40% off.
Yeah, it's not it for a rider. There's moments of this that are beneficial, right?
Mhm.
Because now all of a sudden, yeah, I can buy a bike that maybe was out of my price range previously, but it's a smoking deal. So now I can afford to buy it. The problem is this is not sustainable.
Mhm.
It's not sustainable for the dealer. It's not sustainable for the brand or the supply chain. And so as we ourselves tried to navigate this and tried to figure out like how do we get through it as a small brand as Intense, we had to look really, really hard at the brokenness of the industry. And as we did, and as we really dove deep, what we've come to believe is that ultimately the dealer, the small independent bike owner in the North American market, is the one that's feeling the most compression. They're feeling the most risk. They have the most pressure. And it's because they have all this inventory that they had to take. And now their OE partners are discounting it all. So it's devalued everything that they have. They're incredibly concerned about their ability to make profit. And without profit, they can't stick around, right? So they have this inventory risk, they have credit risk, they have cash flow problems, they have model SKU proliferation where there's just too many choices and you can never get it all right. So all of this is just squeezing your local bike shop. And they're like, how do we survive? Sprinkle on top of that the reality that most of their brands sell online and there's multiple ways for riders to purchase today. They're struggling to really determine like, where's my value proposition anymore to the rider in this whole purchase journey? Like, where do we fit and where do we add value? And so when you put all of that together and then you layer on the fact that some of the biggest brands in the world are also buying retail and starting to do retail and competing with their own customers in many respects, the dealers are just like pulling their hair out. And so we want to find a solution for that. And we believe that we do have a solution for the dealer that is a much healthier, much more disruptive to the historically cash flow sensitive model for dealers. And we're happy to talk about that. But I think what makes it work is we're starting with the rider in mind, because if we don't nail that, then none of the other stuff matters. And so we believe that the rider no longer has the choice that they once had. because they're getting whatever is coming through the pipeline. And oftentimes, because the spec decisions are so delayed, they really don't have much true choice, and they certainly don't have as much personalization as they once had in the past. And so it's almost like this homogenization of the experience. And we want to change that. We want to change how a rider thinks about buying a mountain bike. And we want to do it in a way that leads with value, so that a rider can say, hey, I want to build the bike. I want to have a bike built for me that looks like this. And when you compare that build to the competitive bike that already exists, that the OE chose all the parts for, it's at a price value to that.
So can you explain what you're proposing? Like, I'm a small bike shop, and historically I've been an Intense dealer, but maybe I haven't been doing a lot in the last couple of years. But I like the brand, and the riders in my area like Intense to some degree, or it's like a viable option. What's it going to look like for me as a bike shop owner?
So we are launching a program called the Intense Frame First program. It goes all the way back to everything that Jeff Stever talked about in the beginning. This brand is about the frame first. We fundamentally believe it all starts with the frame in terms of the experience that a rider is going to have on the trail. And so for the dealer, they have an opportunity to do business with Intense and not commit to bringing in any inventory if they don't want to. So we're removing this system of you're committing to 12 months of inventory, and then I hope you sell it, because it's coming, and the value of it's not going to get better. It's likely going to diminish over time. What we're saying is, let's provide the rider an opportunity to optimize the bike the way that they want it, without any compromise, to do it in a value. And we're not asking the dealer to make any sort of substantial inventory commitment. So it becomes a cash flow positive transaction for the dealer to have a customer come in and say, hey, I want to get a mountain bike, but I don't know what I need. And so rather than selecting from the sea of the same, the dealer can immediately step into the expert voice and say, well, how do you ride? Where do you ride? Let's get a bike specifically optimized for what you want and what you need. And the dealer is able to do that in a way that does not require cash outlay and capital and all the risk and everything of that nature. So they're essentially building a bike for the rider the way that they want it. They're going to choose the frame from Intense. So they'll go on to the B2B site and they'll pick the frame. So let's say it's a Tracer and I want the red one and size medium.
Of course you want the red one. Come on.
I have to lead with red, right?
Yeah.
And then it's time to pick the components. We have the benefit of having built a relationship, a working business relationship with Quality Bicycle Products. So this Intense Frame First program is powered by Quality Bicycle Products.
And for listeners that aren't bike shop people, Quality Bicycle Products is QBP. That's it's a parts distributor in the US. It's the biggest one, right? It's the largest parts distributor in the US. Yeah.
By far the largest. 98% of bike shops in the US and Canada have a QBP account.
Yeah.
And so the dealer is very accustomed to conducting business with QBP, as we refer to it, on their B2B platform. So typically if you're a rider and you go into a bike shop and you need to order a part, more often than not, it's probably coming from Quality Bicycle Products.
Okay, so I've got somebody convinced. I've got a consumer convinced. Maybe I have a demo bike or whatever. They want the Intense. We go on the site. We choose the XT spec, but we give him. He really likes those new Mavens. He's got Mavens on there. And hey, it's we're coming into winter, so I've got mud spikes or some bigger tires on there. We press order. The dealer order it. Do I also have to, is it coming as a bunch of parts in a box, or is it coming semi-assembled like from a Taiwanese assembler, or how is it arriving?
Yeah, so the frame will arrive from Intense in a frame box as it would normally. The components will come from any of the 3 US-based warehouses from QVP in a box, or in some cases a couple of boxes. and that will all land at the dealership, and then they will assemble that bike ground up as would normally be done at Asian assembly. The problem with the Asian assembly model is all of that profit for that assembly stays over there. In
And
this
it's
case,
on credit. Yeah.
yeah, well, in this case, the dealer's assembling the bike, and as a result, they're able to participate in the service revenue stream of assembling that bicycle.
What about the halfway house? I know someone like, as an example, Pivot do a lot of their in-house assembly in the US, and then they ship it out. Where was did you, or is that something that what's the difference and the benefit to the consumer of outsourcing the assembly as well?
We feel like the more we can support the dealer, the more healthy the dealer will be. The more we can support the dealer as being that critical component of the purchase journey for the rider, the better for the dealer and the better for the customer, because that dealer, that's their local market. They know the local trails. They understand bike setup in a way that's kind of hard to do at an arm's length sitting back at headquarters. So we want the dealer to have that assembly opportunity. Now, some dealers will be stacked up in service and they're like, man, I'd love to do this, but I'm 2 weeks stacked up. Is there another option? And if they prefer that, Intense will actually assemble the bike for the dealer and then ship the bike to the dealer, call it 98% assembled, throw wheels on, turn the handlebars, torque everything, and you're good to go.
Yeah.
And so does this mean the end to the model year for Intense? Because sometimes the frames stay same color, same everything, but then, like you said, there's a thing where, Fox releases a new grip damper and it's got X2 written on the end, and suddenly, I don't know, I think the consumer sometimes gets kind of sold short by the model year, because then when they're selling their bike, and I don't know, what's going to be the relationship of that going forward?
So we firmly believe that eradicating model years in the mountain bike space is a good thing for all the reasons that you just stated. When you have an old way of operating and you've got this 12 to 18 month lag, it's really hard to get away from it, particularly when you're building a scaled number of complete bikes. But with this new model, to your point, it unlocks our ability to be tethered so closely to model years. So while I won't say we won't have model years in 2025, we are striving to eventually not have to be beholden to model years.
So I, the small bike shop owner, I have to pay a kid a mechanic that has a wage.
It doesn't have to be child labor, Brian.
It doesn't have to be child labor. I know. It's I prefer it to be child labor, though.
Yeah.
As somebody who was the kid in the bike shop assembling the bikes poorly, you have to pay somebody more than I was getting paid back then to build this, because this isn't normally in a bike shop. The bike comes pretty assembled, and a low skill 14-year-old named Brian Park can go and straighten the bars and cut the cardboard off and get it semi-ready for sale. This is not that. This is parts in a box. This is a 4+ hour build, probably. So as a shop person, I'm worried about that a little bit. Am I paying for that, or is the consumer paying for that? Like, how does that look in the value equation?
Yeah, what I would say to that is you're correct in that many brands deliver bikes to the dealers today, mostly assemble, not all brands. There are some really big, well-known, large market shareholders that their bikes arrive to the dealership far from assemble.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up, Mike. I'm
not going to name names, but if you know, you know.
I helped a friend build a bike because when he opened it, he said, I can't do this. And I said, sure, no problem. And it was a frame and a box of individual parts. And it was a frame up build that just the consumer was expected to do, or the shop.
So as a shop, it's harder to get the consumer to understand that I need to charge you a full custom build on this complete bike that you bought for me. as opposed to a bike that's 98% built already. In this realm of true custom bike build, it's acceptable for the dealer to charge the commensurate service rate to have that bike built, whether it's 3 hours or 4 hours. I think average is probably like 3.5.
I was slow. I was pretty slow.
That's okay. It was a while ago. Yeah. But the thing is the way that the financial modeling works, because we're cutting out so much of that waste in Asia, the dealer still can charge the appropriate amount to the customer for that custom build, and it still comes in as a value compared to a complete bike.
So you're assuming a lot more risk with this because there's no booking from the dealer, but you're cutting out some credit and you're cutting out an assembler.
Correct.
Essentially. Are you making any money on the parts or only on the frame? So there's no margin on parts.
Not for us. Nope. That's QBP, and there's a lot of upside for them, right? Because we're helping them organically grow their mountain bike business, and they're taking the risk on the components, on all the necessary parts. It's what they do. It's what they do every day. So their risk mitigation is real compared to ours, because they can sell these parts to a dealer at any point.
And I'll maybe speak to the bikes are the hardest way to make money in the bike industry. You need to have the right bike with the right parts at the right time at the right price, et cetera, and like every single person along the way, from like your dealer to your distributor to your brand to the assembler to the factory that actually made the frame, like everybody wants to assume the least amount of risk and the most amount of margin along the way. That's business. But what you're proposing here, what you guys are launching, is less reliance on the assembler in Taiwan, usually in Taiwan, not always, and more, and then just saying, hey, we're okay to not make money on the fork and the shock and the tires.
We're focused on what we do well, which is building frames that are performance driven and aesthetically distinct and are going to blow people away. And with that being our core and going back to our core, that enables us to not concern ourselves with trying to make margin on a complete bike and all the various components. That's for QBP, but there's all these other areas of waste that we're able to cut out. And because we're focused just on the frame, we can lean in from a margin standpoint for the dealer to make sure that they're happy and profitable and still able to provide that value to the rider. And I think that's the biggest unlock, is if we can get mountain bikers to think differently about how they buy and to see this, what we would call a premium purchase experience, but to understand that they can do it at a value price point that historically custom has been relegated to the tip of the spear, upper echelon, super elite, super expensive, super complex. We're distilling that premium experience down so that the average mountain biker can participate in that newer, more fun way of buying a bike, have it be efficient, and still have that bike come in as a value compared to what that bike would cost pre-built.
Well, just do you think / want this to be adopted by other brands in the industry? Because I'm thinking, another thing, you spoke lots about like sort of how the bike industry works. Another thing this is potentially reducing is warehousing costs, which are very unglamorous but very important. And you heard horror stories in the bike industry going around of they've literally had this bike in a warehouse for 4 years. They have got so much of their old bike they've got 3 years worth of next door to it. They're paying through the eyeballs for both of these things to be warehoused, and they've ended up in this holding pattern of until we can sell the old bike, we can't release the new bike, and we've got so many of the old bike to go. This might ease that a bit, if only because there isn't a centralized place where all these fully built bikes, which are bigger anyway, are going to be stored.
Yes. So we think that, to go back, there's a problem in the industry and no one's addressing it. And eventually it gets to the rider, where the rider's being priced out, or they don't have choice, or it's just It's a detuned purchase experience. And we want to solve for that. And we want to solve for that in a way that supports the IBD. If this mindset shift with the rider and a new, healthier way of doing business with the dealer means that other brands recognize and has that aha moment, like, wait a minute, there is a better way, and more brands start to do this, that's a win for all of us. It really is. And rising tide will rise all ships. And the challenge for the biggest brands in the industry is that they're so locked into scale and the quantity of the business and the operating expenses to support that. It's really hard for a bigger brand to make a shift to kind of go in a different direction. And that's where a small little nimble brand like Intense has an opportunity, point in time when the industry needs it, to lead with a transformative business model. And I hope that it's successful so that other brands start to see this and start to operate this way.
I can imagine when we request bikes for review, a lot of brands are like, sure, we'll send you the XO1 bike or the full XTR bike. And that's not what we're requesting, but they're terrified of the media getting a whatever tiny little negative impression of their product because from a spec choice. Is there concern for you about consumers screwing up your bike by having choice? Like, are you giving them too much rope, like enough rope to hang themselves with here?
I can speak to that, and it kind of goes back to the process of the Frame First program and how that goes down. So as the consumer comes in and they decide on they're going to do a new Tracer 279, dealer orders that from the Intense B2B site, then he goes on QBP and they start choosing parts. This is where we want it to be clear. They're not having to go through and go, what bottom bracket? Okay, search bottom brackets. What handlebars? Oh, oops, I ordered a 31/8 bar and a 35 stem. On QBP's site, we'll have our own what they call a microsite. And so in order to participate in this program, they'll have to submit a dealer application. If they're not already a dealer, current dealers will already be part of that. But when they go to choose the kit, we've already done the work for them and for everybody. So we've put a pre-configured kit on there, gone through and chosen all the parts for it. And so then it'll auto-populate a price, and say they go, wow, I really like all those parts. The price is still a little too high for me. Okay, cool. It starts out as a XO1, T-type drivetrain. Let's go GX. Cool. GX. Like, it's just drop down menu. GX. Bam. Price adjusts. Hey, I don't need carbon bars. I want aluminum. Okay, cool. Those are a little bit cheaper. Swap the grips out. So each component the whole list will be pre-configured, but as they go down, each component will have a drop-down menu for them, and they'll be able to do it. And anything on that drop-down menu is approved and will fit. You know what I mean? And so that's been a bulk of a lot of work behind the scenes of going through that entire process.
So they can still screw it up, but they have to work hard at it.
They got to work pretty hard at it. And I mean, we're relying on the bike shop's knowledge, and like a lot of us, I grew up in bike shops. I grew up working in them, and you learn through that whole process. There's typically at least one guy there that's kind of the top mechanic and knows everything and can partake in that or help the younger guys or whatever through that process. But yeah, we've taken away as much risk as we possibly can, and so you're not going to be able to put a square taper bottom bracket in your order.
It's coming back, buddy.
Yeah,
it's coming back.
It's.
Can you say, if I've got my bike at the moment, I've just upgraded the fork on, and I've got its old fork with it, so I can sell that bike whole. Can I buy a new Intense with everything except the fork?
Mike?
You can buy under the Frame First program. You can buy from Intense. You can buy a frame with no shock, no fork. You can buy a frame with a shock, no fork. You can buy a frame with a shock and a fork, or just the fork. So there's varying degrees of purchase opportunity through Intents. And then if you need to fill in other pieces, that's where the dealer comes in and their connection with QVP. So essentially,
Right, okay.
you can configure it in any way, shape, or form that you need to.
And kind of
So
same
I've
way
got
with the rest of the components, Henry, as you know, you come in and you go, hey dude, like love this. Like the wheels chosen for the parts kit are sick, but I've got my own wheels already. I don't need to spend it. Cool. No wheels. Like, and there will be a limitation to that. So it won't be like, you know, you choose the entire kit and I deselect everything but the grips. You know what I mean? There will be limitations to that. And so the answer to your question is yes. You know, if you come in and you've got your bike, I want to just switch to Intents, but hey, I really like my wheels and my dropper post. Cool, done. Like, and we'll just, as long as obviously like, you know, sizing, spacing, and all that kind of stuff transfers over,
Well,
you'll be
and
able to do that.
and the shop here is like it's a cool opportunity for them because it's a customer and this is their sale. So yeah, they've got to add to the value proposition here where they make good recommendations and help the consumer make good decisions here.
Exactly. And to go back to your point of, you know, the process that we go through behind the scenes as both you and we are very familiar with of, okay, we've got a new product coming out or a new bike. You know, it's under an embargo. We're going to ship it to you. And typically most brands want to ship you the highest quality build or whatever to eliminate any potential negative feedback portrayed to the public. And so this is kind of our gotcha moment, you know. So when we participate in that process now with the media, you guys will have the same opportunity. You know what I mean? And so you'll be able to go in and say, we'll be able to say, hey, we got a new model coming out. And now with the launch of this Frame First program, we'd like you to test it as well. What parts would you like?
Mike Bear tires on everything.
Yep, exactly. And so so what it does though is it's positive for the consumer because they're going to get a much more direct, much more honest review and opinion of the bike without you know going, hey, like I really like this, but gosh, these tires just really didn't do it for me and it kind of ruined my experience. Now you'll be able to personally, if say Brian, you're the one testing, you can go through, you choose all your parts. Now what you're able to do, what you're familiar with, what you're comfortable with, what you like, what you prefer, you have it. And now what you can do is truly eliminate all these factors and really focus on how does a bike ride? How do I like the geometry? How does it behave here? And it really drives the focus back to the frame.
So has a group of like angry product managers not come and tried to lynch you guys for killing their jobs? Like,
no, not yet.
Like, how does that?
We have an awesome product manager.
But I guess they don't have to worry about. They spend more time probably analyzing the competition than they do like banging their head against the spreadsheet.
Well, that and we haven't completely taken their job away. We're still going to offer complete bikes to both our dealers and on our website. And so we haven't completely eliminated the job of product manager just yet. So this is just an opportunity for people to really capitalize on exactly what they want to help the dealer eliminate some risk and participate in a more cash flow positive model, and for that end consumer to be stoked when he rolls that bike out the door. To our point earlier of, dude, I just bought this new bike, you know, complete, and I'm stoked on it. And next week he opens Pinkbike up, and here's the new fork from Fox, and it has all these new features, this, that, and the other. And he goes, dude, now my freaking bike that's a week old or a month old is out to date. I don't have the newest fork or whatever. You know what I mean? And obviously there's still an opportunity for that. But as long as it's available and out and available to the public, he'll be able to select the option, put it on there. And when you're at the trailhead, like, dude, this is my bike. I chose all these parts, or my dealer helped me choose all these parts. So instead of, you know, having two of the same bikes or two same build models that you run into somebody and it's like, oh, cool, high five, we got the same bike. Now it's cool, high five, we got the same bike. Oh, you chose Fox. Oh, you chose RockShox. Oh, I kind of like the seat post you put on there. Hey, how do you like those tires? Like now you've got that. Now you've got that interaction, and like that stoke level goes even one step further when they roll that new bike out the door.
Brian, you had asked about the testing in the review world and how that historically works versus maybe how it will work in this type of environment. And so Mike K from Pinkbike and I had a discussion 3.5, 4 weeks ago. And I said, hey, we have a new platform we're launching at Sea Otter. Really want to get it in front of you. We really want to get it underneath your test riders. And we think that it's going to blow some people's minds. And so first question Mike asked was like, can you give me some of the geos so I can start to get a sense for like what kind of bike this is? And then I can decide who's going to ride it, who's going to test it. So I provided him as much as I could provide him within the confines of still confidentiality. And immediately he's like, oh, I want to ride it. I'm like, okay, great.
Greedy Kaz.
Well, even better. I said, how about this? We're going to allow you to participate in this Frame First program, meaning you're going to tell me how you want us to build this bike for you. And so we've gone through that process with Kaz, and he's defined exactly how he wants this bike to come, and that's exactly how the bike will be delivered to him for that review. So it's really cool that, you know, you bring it up in terms of like, how does that work? And we're already working through it with Pinkbike.
We didn't plan this, I swear.
I was going to say, I don't put it below Kaz to put some parts wrong just so we can fill some column inches. Hey, Brian.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, well, it came with the seat post too short.
Whoever decided the seat post is just wrong. Yeah.
Hey, so I mean, we've alluded to it there. You know, we've spoken about the prototyping phases, the things that the brand is sort of moving away from, both in terms of model as well as some of the bike frames themselves. What can we expect? Can we be teased anything? Is this to complement the downhill stuff?
Everybody who's watching this podcast, if you're on, see, look what Jeff's doing right now. He's trying to get his head in. Zoom in, everybody, just zoom in a little bit. Get your screen grabs here. Jeff, what's coming? Let's get some secrets out of you.
There's only maybe one image back there that might allude to a new direction, but again, just seize in the moment opportunity to evolve what's next for Intense from both the architecture of the frame. We've always been strong on a striking appearance of the bike. I feel like some of the new products coming out take a new design direction, also, as well as a new suspension kinematic layout. So for me, it's an exciting time, and it really segues well into the Frame First program because, again, I might have alluded to this earlier. It's kind of full circle to what Intense strengths were back in the day, and you have to transport yourself back a little bit to those early years when the small brands like Intense, the boutique brands, this was like, they really stood out against, I'd say, the bigger guys because they were very innovative at the time. They could move quickly and come up with new ideas, and hence, this is what put Intense on the map. But we were only able to do frames. So we capitalized on that. At the same time, and this is like the early 90s, there was a really healthy cottage industry of custom components. So it really highlighted the opportunity for people to optimize and build their dream frame into a bike. I'm talking about the era. A lot of the viewers out there probably aren't even aware of like Ringley and Grafton and Cook Brothers, Action Tech, Easton, that era of the anodized purple and turquoise blue that people were building on the Intense frame and Foes frames, Turner frames, you name it at the time, and to build them into what you might call their dream bike. But Intense operated in that space and really kind of dominated for many, many years. And, at one point we were producing between 4,000 and 5,000 alloy frames a year out of our Temecula facilities, frame onlys. And there were a lot of bike shops that capitalized on that because they did these customer spec bikes. Yeah, and what happened in that journey too is like we explained, it's like spec got so good, aftermarket components got so good, that in those kind of choices kind of went away to some degree. But for me, it's music to my ears because it's kind of going back a little bit, and fashion and music reinvents itself every 20 years. I'm kind of right there.
Let me tell you guys, that was the most diplomatic answer from our creative director that you'll ever get. He didn't give you guys anything, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Oh,
Good job, Jeff. I'll give you guys a little more. How about that?
All right, I'll take it.
That was perfect because Jeff is so creative and he's so ahead of it that it's easy for those ideas to come out in advance of when we're ready. So great protective measures on Jeff's part, which I certainly appreciate. But
you're not invited to the next podcast, Mike.
I'll go so far as to say, hey, look, we've got 3 new platforms we're launching in 2025, in addition to Frame First program. The first of those 3 we will unveil at Sea Otter. And we're really excited for the world to get to see and ride that bike. That bike is going to be game changing. And so that's Sea Otter. And then later in the summer, we have 2 more platforms that are coming. And it's a good mix between analog and E as to what these new platforms will be from Intense in 2025. So where, because of the strain in the industry, there's a lot of brands that have decided like, let's pause launching innovation in 2025 because we have so much other stuff to sell. And maybe let's just paint different colors and graphics on the old stuff and get it through. That's not what we're doing. We're leaning into innovation and we're launching 3 new platforms at a time that we think it's right for the brand. And like Jeff said, they're distinct. They are visually distinct, and we think people are going to love them.
Well, I think that's a really exciting note to leave it on. Thank you very much for explaining all things Intense today. Thank you, Brian, for coming on as well. And we will obviously have a full transcript for this. Some great images too of Intense over the years. So if you're watching this on YouTube, please do head over there. And thank you very much for listening. Thank you for tuning in. And thank you for your time today.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.